Our next speaker is Charles Pence from the Université Catholique de Louvain. Charles has been working in the history and philosophy of science, but then also with a strong involvement in quantitative methods in different ways. And so, yeah, floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Let me start a stopwatch so I don't talk for too long. Yeah, thank you so much. This has been really fun already. Given my schedule, it actually was probably unwise of me to accept this invitation, but the theme was so cool that I was like, I can't say no to this. Like, I've wanted someone to have a conference on this for years. So yeah, I'm really, really happy to be here. Let me say a couple of things just by way of like what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, because yeah, this is also a strange talk for me. I also, 2 talks in a row without data, my apologies. Very unusual for this group. But when I have Metascience up there, I should start by saying that I actually don't mean Metascience in the way that Cassie just meant Metascience. I mean Metascience as in capital M Metascience, the newfangled Metascience guys of the Metascience conferences of the last few years. And this talk is motivated by a kind of discomfort that I've had. And that discomfort goes something like this. So it was clear to me from the very beginning of reading press releases and whatnot coming out of that initiative that there was something somewhere between ignorance of and utter hostility to the philosophy of science. One even read things like in press coverage around these meetings, can you believe that there's no discipline that studies the generation of scientific knowledge and the structure of scientific theories and their change over time? I'm like, we've, I'm not clicked into the slides. There we are. Oh, maybe. But I'm like, once I got over being angry about it, because, we've been publishing pretty much uninterruptedly in English since 1830. You could go read our stuff maybe if you wanted to. But once I got over that, this has sort of posed a kind of intellectual puzzle for me ever since. And the intellectual puzzle is like, what don't I like? What is it that bugs me about this literature? When I read this newfangled reproducibility crisis metascience literature, there's something that feels off, and I don't know what it is. And so that's what I want to try to explore today. So I'm gonna unpack that in a couple of different ways. I'm going to start by talking about what metascience might mean, what it has meant in the past to philosophers of science, and then what I think it means now to this new group of scholars. And then I'm going to zero in on a problem, and it's a problem that, yay, came up in the Q&A a bit ago. And that's the question of the relationship between the descriptive and the normative in meta-level studies of science. And I'm a philosopher of science, so I'm going to talk about it from my philosophy of science perspective. Unavoidable name there being Willard Van Orman Quine, but there's a whole spectrum of naturalisms in philosophy of science. Philosophers of science have, for about 60 or 70 years now, been fairly unified around the idea that science should be guiding our philosophical insight. We've been absolutely not unified at all around what it means to utter that sentence. And so I want to try to talk about that a little bit. I think what that really zooms in on is a kind of awkwardness, a kind of tension between descriptive and normative efforts in philosophy. And then I'm going to gesture. So first half of the problem, the diagnosis of the uneasiness that I felt, I think, is that some of this contemporary work takes the normative dimension of meta-scientific work to be entirely unproblematic and uncomplicated, where I think it is a lesson of the history of the philosophy of science that we need a radically more significant amount of nuance, right? I then want to not only be negative, I want to try to gesture at a couple of ways that we might kind of smooth this tension over, both by asking philosophers to bend a little bit and by asking the metascience folks to bend a little bit so that we might be able to meet in the middle. So there is a bit, I'll put on my Pollyanna hat a little bit at the end too. I'll talk about that when I get there, but yeah, I think the take-home message, if you want to talk in 5 seconds, is that for me at least, part of this uncomfortable relationship comes back to this question about how we juggle the descriptive and normative aspects of what we do. Two quick caveats. I already gestured at this caveat. So yes, when I say metascience, I probably don't mean what almost everyone in this room does. That's a very important caveat. I know this is a quantitative studies of science / science of science group. This is not a capital M 21st century metascience outfit. So I don't mean to be tarring everyone with the same brush. That's very important. Caveat number two is, what the heck do I mean by philosophy of science? I do think that there is a, how to put it, I'll gesture at Wittgenstein as the kind of token villain in this context in a minute, but I do think there are certainly strains in the philosophy of science of what one might call, probably not unjustly, kind of anti-scientific philosophies of science. That's obviously not what I mean. I mean kind of the mainstream of 20th century philosophy of science, which we actually just saw presented very nicely in a single slide. So you've been there. You got it. That stuff. So what could metascience mean, or what has metascience meant? Historically speaking. And I mean, the first thing that I want to underline is just that this is a weird term, right? It's an old term. It has its oldest roots in early 20th century kind of logical positivist approaches to thinking about what would be the metalogical language in which we could express scientific theories. That's not really the sense that we mean. I think the first person to really run with the sense of metascience that we have tended to have in mind was Mario Bunge, fantastic Argentinian philosopher of science who only just recently died at the age of 100, but who wrote a book in, because this is what happens if you live for 100 years, wrote a book in the late 50s that was entitled Metascientific Questions. That I think is actually a really interesting, it's a kind of popular lecture series turned into a book. It's a really fun read. It's a work that I did not know at all before I started preparing for this talk. And it's like a soft recommend. I haven't read the whole thing. That's why it's only a soft recommend. But Bunge develops there a vision of metascience, and it's a bit like hearing about the discussion we've already had of the content of Bernal's book. It's let's say it's a big umbrella. Because he conceives it as containing, at the very least, philosophy of science, right? So that's when we examine, we take the methods and results of science as our object as philosophers. Philosophy in science. So this philosophy in science is actually, I didn't know this either, a very old idea. Which is to say, for Bunge, the implications and consequences, philosophically speaking, of what scientists are doing. Philosophy from science, which is what happens if we take some traditional philosophical questions like metaphysics and free will and this kind of ethics and that kind of stuff, but do it from a scientific basis. The philosophy with science, by which he just means we should probably be up to date with what the scientists are up to, and philosophy for science, which is to say philosophy that's actually actively helpful for scientific practice. Bunge wants to say metascience is that stuff. So all of that at the same time. Or maybe seriatim, but more or less the union of all of that. But for Bunge, already in the mid 50s, he notes that this makes the question of normativity kind of complicated, right? And he's actually on his guard against what he calls philosophy over science. That's something that we shouldn't have, he says. That would be something that would suggest a discipline higher than the special sciences, either in penetration, value, or power of some sort, a kind of scientia rectrix, claiming such a final rectorship that scientists just ignore it. And rightly so, scientific inquiry welcomes criticism, but does not tolerate edicts. Science is its own lawgiver. And this question of normativity was picked up very early on in the discussions about Bunge's concept of metascience, not least of which in a book review of Bunge's book and another book of his, double review by Paul Feyerabend, another famously, well, debatably anti-scientific philosopher of science. I think he's probably not, but he's very hard to read. But Feyerabend just says, look, man, it's never clear whether when he gives us prescriptions for methodological rules, whether those are supposed to be the result of empirical research concerning the way in which contemporary scientists proceed, or whether the items are supposed to be norms rather than descriptions. And so from the very beginning, it's been noted that there is this tension, and this tension falls out. Even if you just read Bunge's work directly, he's not clear about this. He's worried about this philosophy over science, but then sometimes he says, well, metascience involves not only the examination of the philosophical presuppositions of scientific research, but it's entitled to undertake creative investigation on a level different from that of science, though founded on it. Maybe that's just philosophical, but like, is that normative or not? Is that supposed to intervene in science or not? Even weirder, he says at some point that metascience discloses conceptual sickness and prescribes treatments for it. Now that sounds real normative, right? And so the point that I first just want to make is like from the very beginning of the use of this term, this was weird, right? This was a tension. Is this just describing what scientists are doing, or is this intervening on scientific practice? Now, fast forward to like 2019, right? Fast forward to the contemporary newfangled capital M reproducibility crisis-driven metascience movement. I wasn't sure exactly of the audience. Now I'm pretty sure that the following couple of slides are entirely unnecessary, but I'll still define it for you just for the sake of logical and presentational completeness. Modern metascience is neither a descendant of philosophy nor social studies of science. Instead, it's better understood as a scientific social movement, advocating for significant changes to scientific practice and policy to meet what its adherents perceive to be a reproducibility crisis. And so there's kind of a motivating mission statement. Here is something that looks a bit more like a structure. Metascience represents the confluence and cross-fertilization of three pre-existing trends: statisticians and experimental methodologists promoting greater research integrity, quantitative studies of science by data science, that is science of science properly speaking, and open science activism. And he even notes that they note, I should say, Peterson Panofsky note that this has had boomerang effects into the science of science community, right? This is not just left science of science neutral over the course of the development of this new sort of social trend. They underline, I think rightly so, the scale of new wave science of science, the kind of stuff that we can do now as opposed to what we could do 50 years ago, the history that we just heard, is new, but also increasingly, at least in some quarters, there is a willingness to transition, as they put it, from a strictly descriptive science to a diagnostic and experimental one. I think that's a difficult statement. That's a problematic and controversial statement. I think we saw in the history of scientometrics that we just watched, not pure description before 2019. I don't think that's a fair picture of the history here. But at least it's. I think I wanted to quote this to give you the how to put it. To present that this sentiment exists in the literature, if you haven't seen it. Another thing, of course, that distinguishes this contemporary push from older, more historic pushes is money. So here is an interview, notably with a staff director at the Wellcome Trust, who says, well, if we're going to do research on the scientific process, then why would we not want to use that evidence to be able to improve the research enterprise? So not just doing meta research for the sake of research, but for the purpose of actually translating that evidence, those insights, into change that benefits everyone. And this is not under the surface. This is part of the very, very how to put it, front and center mission statement of this new work. Here's out of the Council on Open Science mission statement from back in 2017. It's a culture change organization that aims to align scholarly values with scholarly practices by developing and advancing a systems level strategy for changing culture. You would need to, wouldn't you? And behavior toward greater rigor, transparency, and sharing of research process outputs and outcomes, right? In short, right, there are no qualms here about normative intervention, right? Any nuance, any difficulty, any confusion about the relationship between the descriptive and the normative has largely evaporated. I want to pause right here as well and do one more caveat, which is cool. I normally never am like doing more qualifications 15 minutes into a talk, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'm actually not going to talk about the content of these norms. I can say something about it in the Q&A if people are interested. I actually think Peterson and Panofsky make a very compelling argument that there is a kind of late stage capitalist notion of efficiency really driving a lot of the work in that sphere. I think that's a very weird norm. I think it's a very problematic norm. I think it's a norm that is rendered really difficult to sustain by a lot of work in HPS and STS. But I'm actually gonna set that aside for now, just because I only have whatever 30, 40 minutes. What I want to do instead, though, is just take a step back and think for a moment about this relationship between the descriptive and the normative. Because if you've, for those of you probably who have even dabbled in 20th century philosophy of science, you know that this is a fraught question. This is an extremely fraught question in the last 60 years of philosophy of science tradition. And so I want to try to look at what happens if we take that literature and a little bit more seriously and think about what philosophical discussion about normativity might mean for the kinds of interventions that might be proposed in this community. Now, I want to be clear, I am not the first to note gaps between extensive discussions in philosophy or STS contexts and the metascience context. He's probably been wondering if I was going to, I missed a slide here. He's probably been wondering if I was going to quote his interview that's quoted in this paper, where he says, those people don't read cytometrics, they don't read STS works, they just reinvent the wheel, which I think is maybe right. But I'm gonna just zoom in on one aspect of this for now. I should have asked you to perform your own quotation. So yeah, this heavy reliance on a normative angle has been noted, right, in analyses of contemporary metascience. Here we have, again, I'm really leaning on them. It's a wonderful paper. Peterson and Panofsky note that the project itself seems to be founded on a set of ideas that find few supporters in the philosophy or social studies of science. First of all, that quote unquote science is a coherent entity on which to intervene, but there is a singular method for science, and that efficiency is a meaningful concept in the area of basic research. But yeah, let me step back and think about normativity in general. And if you're a philosopher and you're thinking about the relationship between normative and descriptive work in philosophy, you're going to have to talk about Willard Van Orman Quine. Here he is on a boat, 1908 to 2000. Quine is worried about this question in a much broader kind of context. Quine is worried about what he would call, although he would never define it as clearly as one might like for a topic, for a concept that's supposed to be central to his philosophical outlook. But he is concerned with what he calls naturalism in philosophy. So I already gestured at this, right? The idea is that science should be our guide when we do philosophical work, right? We don't want to philosophize ignorant of that which is scientific. I just want to underline the pun that I'm about to do here. Here is Quine on a boat, and then here is Quine saying, the reason I shall not be impressed by this is that my position is a naturalistic one. I see philosophy not as an a priori, propedeutic, or groundwork for science, but as continuous with science. I see philosophy and science as in the same boat. A boat which, to revert to Neurath's figure, as I so often do, we can rebuild only at sea while we are staying afloat in it. There is no external vantage point, no first philosophy. And so I think this has been, I mean, this was part of why this was become so influential in philosophical discourse, is that this seemed really compelling to a vast swath of philosophers at work in the second half of the 20th century. But one might immediately wonder, right, if philosophy is not an a priori groundwork for science, if philosophy is continuous with science, if we really are on the boat, how are we going to be able to ground normative insight, right? This is a real live question. And Quine thinks about this. He's obviously worried about this. He's not at all ignorant of this problem. He notes that traditional epistemology was in part normative in intent, right? Part of the point of the foundational works in epistemology is to tell you what knowledge is so that you might get better at having it, to tell you what you ought to be doing, how you ought to be getting knowledge of the external world. Naturalistic epistemology, in contrast, is viewed by some, like Henry Launer and others, as purely descriptive. And Quine, for his part, says, I disagree. Just as traditional epistemology on its speculative side gets naturalized into science or next of kin, so on its normative side, it gets naturalized into technology, the technology of scientizing. And if ever there was a phrase that sounds good to a room full of metascience people, like, yeah, cool. We're going to naturalize epistemology into the technology of scientizing. And he makes this pretty explicit in terms that I think would be familiar to everybody here, right? He says, and if that's not good enough, right, if you want more detail, we can look to the heuristics of hypothesis, how to think up a hypothesis worth testing. This is where considerations of conservatism and simplicity come in, at a more technical level, probability and statistics. And this is just the kind of stuff that we have been interested in lately. Now that said, those whatever 3 quotes from Quine that I've shown you, I think seem a lot clearer at first blush than they actually are. And so if you really start to try to crack into what Quine is trying to tell you, this gets a lot more complicated. And it's bequeathed in the whatever, that's Quine's 69 word and objects, so whatever, 50 years, 60 years. In those 60 years, we've had no small amount of spilled ink about the question of naturalism, up until the point that Larry Sklar, extremely well-known philosopher of physics, writes this paper at one point. Love to be a naturalist if only I knew what naturalism was. It's actually a delightful paper about interpretation of theories in theoretical physics, but I digress. How to take on board these insights, what this descriptive normative relationship ought to look like for philosophers who are interested in and sensitive to, nonetheless, the deliverances of scientific practice, is just not a question that we have a consensus about. So let me at least kind of sketch a bit what might worry you here. And there's a lovely paper by Kyle, who writes trying to unpack Quine. He's desperately trying to figure out what a consistent reading of Quine on naturalism might be. He says, well, look, we've already got some weird contradictions and problems, right? Think about the question of what gets to count as being scientific evidence. That's already an interesting problem. But how is your answer to that question going to be continuous with scientific practice? What does that even mean? Right? Scientific practice needs to know what counts as good evidence. How can you be continuous with it if you're putting that very thing in question? So as he in his words, it's simply not true that this question can be settled by scientific method alone. As the phrase "the last arbiter" suggests, Quine at some point says that scientific practice has to be the last arbiter in these kinds of questions. It's just not clear what that it can play that role. Of course, an appeal to scientific method, parentheses S, parentheses, amorphous or not, is going to play an important role, right? We have to care about what the scientists are doing. But it's not going to be just a sort of, we go ask the science, we go look at science, and then we immediately know normatively what we ought to be telling people about how they should be doing science. That's just not how this is going to work. Clarifying and analyzing our most basic concepts. Sure, that might be part of the scientific enterprise if, and this goes back to Cassie's talk, if we embrace an idea whereby the scientific enterprise is like the sum total of human knowledge, right? If we let in all of the Wissenschaften and we let in the Russian word that I've forgotten, cool, right? But that still means that it's not part of science that, as also borrows terminology of Quine's, which directly faces the tribunal of experience. That is to say, you can't do an experiment to tell you what should count as good scientific evidence. It's not a thing. It belongs to a more general and more abstract part of science, which some non-naturalist philosophers, there are still a few, like to call a priori. And so let me let me draw for you then a bit the extremes of this, right? On the one end, the philosopher and actually well known as a philosopher of history and literature, Arthur Danto wrote in 1967, well, look, should there be a conflict between common sense and science, it must be decided in favor of science, inasmuch as it employs, but more rigorously, the same method that common sense does and cannot therefore be repudiated without repudiating common sense itself. So, well, cool. Naturalism just means do what the scientists tell you to do all the time. Fine. The other extreme would be to follow, this is middle period Wittgenstein, for those of you who are experts in Wittgenstein, which I'm not. The philosophers constantly see the method of science before their eyes and are tempted to ask and answer questions in the way science does. This tendency is the real source of metaphysics and leads the philosopher into complete darkness. So, in other words, naturalism bad. Don't do your philosophy by looking at science. Do your philosophy by something else. What something else is has, in fact, never in my life been clear to me. But I'm a naturalist, so I would say that. Long story short, right, we're trying to think about what it means to draw normative conclusions from the sciences. And there is a massive spectrum here that goes from Dante all the way to Wittgenstein via Quine in some random point in the middle that's hard to pin down, right? And so the moral of the story that I want to draw here is just to underline the presence of this nuance. There's a deep fundamental disagreement about how we should relate descriptive analysis of the sciences to normative interventions on the sciences. And that nuance is just almost gone in the way that Cash should have capitalized the M. Capital M Metascience considers its normative orientation. And so this, at least, I think I finally understand what my unease was. I think this is what makes me uncomfortable about what they're up to. I think the idea that we can just sort of go collect some data and then the normative conclusions about what we should do about it will be so luminously obvious that we need not theorize about that connection at all. I think that's what makes me, gives me a kind of unease, even when, we're talking about this at coffee break, even when I think the empirical stuff is good, right? Even if I like their empirical analyses. It's that slippage that makes me uncomfortable. But let me not just talk about me being uncomfortable. Let me talk about what we might do about it, because I do want to have a bit of a positive vision here at the end. So I think we actually have some examples in the philosophy of science of nuanced middle road approaches. Excuse me, ways in which we might think about the normativity of philosophy of science or metascientific work. We just have to make sure that we're looking at the right places. We have to look at examples where we have successfully done this kind of hybrid normative, non-normative work. Don't hit that X. Just stay. Thank you. I moved my notes. It was a tactical error. So the first place that I think we've seen some really excellent reflection on this is in the trend in the last, I would say, 20 to 30 years of the philosophy of science that's focused on what philosophers have taken to calling the philosophy of science in practice. The philosophy of science in practice has really tried to embed itself in scientific practice. And it's tried to do that in part, or at least one of the major consequences of that embedding has been to rethink the ways in which normative values wind up appearing in that scientific practice. And so here's a lovely quote from Matt Brown, who's notes, I think quite rightly, that there are a lot of concepts that might seem purely descriptive, evaluatively neutral, that after a bit of analysis turn out not to be at all. And so concepts like gender equality, poverty, and well-being all have an inextricable mix of descriptive and evaluative content, and the attempt to regiment concepts into purely descriptive and normative ones distorts what such concepts mean and impairs, there should probably be an S there, our ability to articulate, operationalize, and reason with such concepts. And what I like about this is, I want to be clear, I'm not only criticizing that is to say, I'm not only criticizing the capital M meta-scientists. I think this is a thing that philosophers of science often get confused. Put differently, I've been talking the whole time as though there was a sort of ironclad dichotomy between descriptive stuff and normative stuff. right? And that the question was about how do we relate the descriptive stuff to the normative stuff? One thing that I think recent philosophy of science can teach us is the descriptive stuff and the normative stuff is related by the world. It's already entangled. It's been entangled. It's still entangled. You cannot talk about gender in God's year 2024 without engaging norms, right? This is not a thing that people can do. You need to recognize that, and you have to figure out how to recognize that. You need a theory about how recognizing that will look. And to be clear, an article from 2021, this is an unsolved problem in the philosophy of science. We don't have a sort of clear way to handle these kinds of thorny cases. But a lot of the things that we're most interested in are going to drag us into these morasses where evaluations are normative and norms are evaluative. Descriptions are normative and norms are descriptive. And there's just no way for us, there's going to be no way for us to get around that. That, I think, is a recommendation largely to the philosophy of science community. To turn to some recommendations going the other direction, I want to also point to, again, this is a bit more recent work. In the last 10 or 15 years, we've also seen by some of these same authors, actually, including Matt Brown, who's now the director of the John Dewey Archive, which is super cool. Unjustly neglected philosopher, but I'm going to get off my stump before yeah, it's going to be very problematic. Anyway, there's been a turn back toward pragmatist philosophy of science in the last 20 or 25 years. And I think this has been a very welcome turn, in part because the American pragmatists were deeply worried about exactly this problem. They were deeply worried about how you put into practice systems of inquiry that are going to have to oscillate back and forth between description of the world, intervention in the world, and the normative judgments about what's good or bad in the world. That's a foundational premise of the kind of work that they're doing. And in fact, just precisely in the application of some of those pragmatist theories to contemporary philosophy of science, we see some prescriptions that I think are really helpful. So Hassuk Chang is a phenomenal philosopher of science out of Cambridge, who's been on the cutting edge of this kind of stuff in the last few years. He just wrote in a recent book, he says, pointing to some methodological changes that were brought about by more careful consideration of pragmatist and value concerns. He says these changes were not sanctioned by some super method or an overarching theory of physics. He's talking in this case about physical sciences, but only by some detailed case-by-case arguments about how the telescopic or thermometric observation should be given more credence than unaided perception. Now, what lesson do I want to draw from this? Well, the lesson I want to draw from this is, I think pragmatist analyses have been also teaching us that case-by-case approaches are becoming extremely important, right? I think another thing that might give you some unease about the contemporary capital and metascience work is the search for the super method, right? There is very much a one-size-fits-all kind of ghost looming in the background here that I think we need to be out in front on resisting in a way the philosophers of science at least haven't been enough yet. And this carries into evaluation. And so here's Hassuk again back in 2014, where he notes that evaluating theories is complex business. And I think the structure of activities and systems that I've outlined helps us make sense of the complexity involved. Overall evaluative notions like truth and success need to be dissected significantly in order to become applicable to systems of practice. And the talk of the aims of science and general epistemic values and virtues need to be concretized in the context of each activity and system we're considering. And to be very clear here, he does not think that there is an activity or system that corresponds to all of science at once, capital S science, right? I think we've got to be able to break down to smaller scales. And so the lessons that I would maybe offer to try to bridge this, tentatively offer to try to bridge this gap would be the following. I think philosophers really need to rethink the ways in which we've separated the descriptive and the normative enterprises. I think the kind of specter of Quinian naturalism might be perhaps a provocative thing to say, but might be past its sell-by date. And so we need to be prepared to watch that frontier dissolve, especially in context of contemporary sciences where the descriptive and the normative are tightly intertwined. For metascientists, capital M metascientists, abandon the ideal of a singular scientific method. Let's figure out how to embrace local scale interventions into scientific practice, as well as the impact that that kind of local scale breakdown can have on these ostensibly global notions like truth and success. And I think we've got to be ready, for much as we may or may not like it. I don't know that I like it myself. I have deeply foundationalist intuitions. I was trained as a physicist. I have deeply foundationalist intuitions. I don't like the idea that we might see notions like truth and success sort of dissolve into cluster concepts. But I think that may happen whether we like it or not. And so I think we need to be prepared to think about what that can look like in context of evaluating the scientific enterprise. And with that, I will stop talking, and I'm very happy to hear your questions because, yeah, I have a feeling that there's things that I've missed. So I would love to know what they are.
Thanks.
Thanks so much. So, questions? This one here.
Two comments. One is that you mentioned Chang, and it reminds me that this philosophy turned to practice is in fact philosophers who have finally understood what the sociology of science was doing since the 70s, Harry Collins' work on reproducibility. So everything that Chang you quote is just a restatement by philosophers of the 30 years of work by sociologists of science. They look at the practice, look at the small cases, there's no overarching things. The norms are defined by the community because there's no God outside saying, you should do that. Okay, so it's a good thing. I remember I said to a lot of philosophers, good, now you come back to reality, which is sociology. That's the reality. The second comment is about because it's a famous book by Hilary Putnam, Fact and Value, which is full of logical mistakes, because the statements, and it's very interesting that, for example, you quote, you say, okay, fact and value are inextricably mixed. Those are statements. I read a lot about this fact and value, and every time they say, oh, we cannot separate facts from value, I said, yeah, that's what you say. Let's look at the analytics. So when they say that, they mix the fact that in the world, everything is in everything, okay? But in philosophy, you have concepts. And since Locke and Hume, I have seen no work in philosophy, in analytic philosophy, showing me that you can move from fact to value without non sequitur. I've never seen that. Even the book by Putnam, who says this, he does that. When you read the book, he does not that at all. He says that we should not do that. Of course, we should not do that. We should not do war either. So the fact is that those who say that, I've never seen an argument. So if there are one, I would like to read it. Because in practice, you have no choice. And you can have in sociology, in fact, that's what Merton does, you have description of norms. You describe the norms, and then the norms will change with time. For example, now we do double blind in medicine because we know that physicians, in fact, had no proof, but he said, I had the benchmark. Now it's the statisticians. So the methodology, the norms in clinical medicine has been changed after the Second World War. We describe that norm. We're not normative. And even, and I conclude with this, even the argument that, you know, when you use gender or poverty, you cannot separate the facts from the value. That's just a word to say that. That's totally false. That's so the fact that people will take my description to make normative statements is obvious. But it can be constructed in a purely methodological way. For example, the notion of poor is the line of poorness. There's a famous paper by Hacking on this, the line of poverty. It's a descriptive norm defined by the community. After that, you can be that people should not be poor. So I've seen no proof that norms and facts are mixed up in analytical theory.
Okay.
In reality, everything is in everything, as I said.
I'm first just to say I'm totally happy with the idea that we've just finally come back to the social stuff, and this is actually how I teach philosophy of science now. So that I'm completely on board. Yeah, so are facts and values inextricably in fact or inextricable in fact or in theory? That is an excellent question. I mean, a few things to say. Of course, I'm not going to resolve this today because this is also still an open debate in philosophy of science. You're not alone. You're not the only person who has argued that. I am tempted. So the reason to put it, the argument that I have here is, in fact, I think for my part, more historical than philosophical. So this is where the history and philosophy of science part of my training steps in. I am tempted to say that I don't feel like I understand the concept of gender or of poverty unless I understand the history of the concept of gender or poverty. And then I feel like I don't understand those histories unless I understand the normative content that the people who were building them were packing into those notions over the course of the history of their development. Now, I'm happy to say, if for you that's a notion of concept that's much too thick, you think that's a useless notion of concept, it's too heavy, it does too much work, fair enough. But I was too brainwashed by my training in history of science.
Thank you, Charles. It was really cool. So again, I have a sort of follow-up on this entanglement between values and descriptions. So do you think that's key concept in psychometrics, like impact, innovation, interdisciplinarity, they suffer from this entanglement? And do you think it should be better for psychometrics to clearly distinguish them, or it's inevitably part of them?
This could
You have psychometricians.
Yeah, well, and also it's like that could have been a different talk. I was actually thinking to myself, like, I should have given that talk. Been a cool talk. I'm going to answer with the only example that I have studied enough to be confident of my understanding of, and that's interdisciplinarity. The philosophy of interdisciplinarity, if some of you have not read it, is an absolute wild west. It's crazy. There is no consensus at all. Everyone thinks that it's a radically weird cluster concept. No one can find definitions that seem to apply to more than like one enterprise. And I think part of the explanation of that has to be the normative bearing, the normative load that concept carries. No one has ever used interdisciplinary as an insult, or at least it doesn't happen very often, right? Think about what when your Rector Magnifico says interdisciplinary, he or she is thinking, and that's the good stuff, right? Yeah, like it's in there, right? I actually just filled out a survey for my own university about what do you think about the efforts that we're doing to support interdisciplinarity, right? I'm pretty sure if I had put in there, interdisciplinarity bad, I think they might have just sacked me summarily from the faculty. I think that has to have something to do with it, right? And I've talked about this a little bit in the context of kind of the future directions for biological research, where everyone talks about wanting to integrate. Everyone talks about wanting to be interdisciplinary, but no one can figure out what that is other than a sort of positive normative feeling. And I think that's really problematic. And I think philosophers have work to do here. I think this is actually a place where we, if you will, have fallen down on our jobs a little bit, because I think you're exactly right that analyses of these concepts are important, are needed, and we're not doing it. And I think that's bad. It's, the flip side of philosophy of science not being read is there are obvious gaps in our literature where we could be writing things that would be useful to more of the people in this room, and those papers don't exist. So, have to take our knocks when they're justified.
Oh, sorry. Then another one. Okay.
Thank you very much for unfolding all that complexity. I'm very intrigued, but I also, from time to time, got lost, if I'm honest. And I think because I'm not in philosophy of science anymore, although my PhD is from philosophy of science, but then it was a PhD done in GDR. And the department for philosophy of science was actually called philosophy of Marxist-Leninist, Marxist-Leninist philosophy of science. And what I was trained with is actually classifications of philosophy, a kind of terms like materialism, idealism, streams in philosophy, which were related to the circumstances of those who reflected at that time, and their position in society and the society itself. And sometimes my feeling is, if we only analyze, and there was a long debate I had with Lud Leiderstov, if you only analyze the communication and what's left in traces in communication, and if you don't look at the circumstances under which this, we don't get a right picture. Or maybe that's my problem, I don't get a right picture. So could you imagine to tell this story in terms of the biographies of those figures which you reflect upon?
That's a fantastic question. Again, that could be a talk. I'm going to say two things: one anecdotic and a bit provocative, and then another a bit more hopeful for the future. The anecdotic and a bit anecdotal and a bit provocative response would be to say, yes, absolutely. For example, there is, I think, a very interesting story that has been told a bit by Fons de Wolf, who works in Ghent, about the relationship between the political commitments of these philosophers and the theories of science that they proceeded to develop. So why would someone really want to divorce the descriptive from the normative? Well, you might really want to divorce the descriptive from the normative if you worked in America in the mid-century, and you knew that the people who were most well known for associating the descriptive and the normative were people like Engels. So if you want to not be called a communist, maybe you should separate the descriptive from the normative. I don't have the competence remotely to evaluate that story, but that's a cool story. And it's exactly in the line that you mentioned. More seriously, I mean, one thing that I didn't do here, right, is I did not talk about how what I was trying to do could be informed by what's happening in other parts of metascience, as we just saw. Largely because I'm not competent to tell that story. I'm a philosopher, and I'm like 50% of the trained historian. I can play a historian on TV very compellingly. That's all I can speak to. So I think you're right that, well, this comes back to Eva as well, that the sociological angle is missing from the talk I gave. Clearly, yes, I am not a sociologist of science, and I don't know it, but I think you're spot on that there, as we've already heard this morning, the argument for that dialogue is very strong. And I would love to be able to collaborate in ways to bring it back. I sadly, there once were, but there are no longer sociologists of science at my university. So hard to do. You're contractually obligated to be nice.
Yeah. I actually wasn't planning to be nice. I wanted to defend the meta-science a bit, just because I really like the intuition they have, like the aim that when we study science, ultimately we want to understand it to make science work better, make it a better tool. And I feel like that's really missing from philosophy of science. Like philosophers of science, they do their metaphysics, sometimes meta-metaphysics and truth makers, and I don't know what. I mean, it's really crazy if you hear it. And I think it would be great for philosophy of science if we had this motivation of, well, ultimately we want to help the scientists do better science. Like, I know that it's good to be nuanced and so on, but that's really missing from philosophy of science, and I think it would be great if we had the explicit aim of trying to do that.
I don't necessarily, actually, we were talking about this over the coffee break. I don't necessarily disagree with that. I think what worries me is, how to put it, I have always taken one of the cardinal academic sins to be treating a problem as simple if some other discipline has shown you that it's extremely complicated. And I think that's what gets me here, right? Which is to say, I think the question of how can we make the kind of, and this one I can say broadly and launch it at everyone in the room. I think the question of how do we make the metascientific work that we all are interested in and care about be relevant for scientists, and in some sense, to be specified, improve the scientific practice. I think that is an extremely important question. I think the problem is it's an extremely hard question. And I worry that I just don't see, if you will, I don't see struggle with the difficulty of the problem in the way that I would want to. You know, I don't see struggle with the content of the norms. I don't see struggle with the bridge from the descriptive to the normative. I don't see struggle with the proper nature and role of scientific concepts. I mean, all of these kinds of debates that I think, sure, I'm not asking that everyone solve everything before we do anything, right? I don't mean to be saying that, but at least argue for me what you think your answers to these questions are. Oh, show me that you realize that there is work here that should be done. That's what I worry is insufficiently present in this context. I don't want to renounce. I don't know. I don't want to make it sound as though I want to renounce the normative. But I think, yeah, we have to lean in and do the hard, nasty work that we don't want to do. And for philosophers, that's do the empirical stuff and largely do the ethics. Philosophers have been wary of doing those. For the metascience community, it's do the conceptual work and think about the philosophy, which they haven't wanted to do either. But I think if we all will do that, we'll all get better.
Thanks, Charles. So I've got a real philosopher's question.
Cool.
Or I guess, I'm not sure it's a question. It's maybe a strategy for going forward. I was having the same worries Eve expressed about your attack on the fact value distinction. I guess I'm in the same school, but whatever. So I want to give you a different notion that might to work with. That might be useful. So I had to really stretch my memory here. So it's the notion of an essentially contested concept. So and it goes back to, I had to look this up while you were talking, W.B. Galley from the 1950s. So he's in Oxford.
That's a name I've not heard.
Yeah.
In a long time.
Oh yeah, in a long time. Okay. So and I'll illustrate it with an example. So the Canadian political theorist C.B. Macpherson gave a series of lectures which were published in a book on democracy and as an essentially contested concept. So he was looking at democracy in the language of the time, first world countries, second world countries, and third world countries. And he's saying all of them have a case to saying it's a democracy. And so in a similar way, I think that might be the sort of framework or set of approach into it rather than going after the fact value distinction. Because I think we like to just repeat what Eve said, especially in sociology, we operationalize terms all the time. So we're stipulating this is a descriptive term. So it doesn't matter. Like, so a gay person is one who has sex with men, or a gay man with 7 times, you know, or plus. So, I mean, then it's very easy to figure out who's gay and who isn't, right? And then similarly with any other concept you want. So there's no normative baggage there, none whatsoever.
Good. I have like once in my life crossed paths with that essentially contested concept work. That's a cool idea. I'll go read it.
I think this is a follow-up. Yes, on something else. Again,
from the point of view of the sociologist. Again, you see, they do the empirical thing. That's what sociologists do. An historian. And history is a form of sociology, historical sociology. So look, I think that the reflexivity is important here. For example, we talked at the beginning of about the reproducibility crisis. A lot of sociologists, and I remember I went to a colloquium on this question, is there a crisis of reproducibility? And with many other sociologists said, there's no crisis of reproducibility. So why are we talking about this? It's because scientists, contrary to sociologists, realize that it's difficult to make a reproduction. It's very difficult, but there's no crisis. There's a crisis. In one sense, there is a crisis. Scientists realize that nobody reproduced things. I can read Collins, read Merton. We wrote in the 70s that, of course, nobody would reproduce paper. Why? Because we won't get another pricing. I reproduce Charles Pence paper. Okay, you would say you lost your time because we believe in your paper. So what the crisis means is the consciousness of a given community, social psychologists in that particular case, biology to some extent, and in the industry, the biotech company used to believe in the paper. Then they realize in their lab that they don't reproduce what the scientists at the university does. So they send the market as a crisis, and we pay for this. And we lose millions of dollars because we believe in your stupid paper. We are not. So there's a sociology. At the end, it comes reflexivity. You say, oh, there's a crisis. No, there's no crisis. There's a recognition of something. So this reflexivity, I think, is very important to say, okay, why do I use this word now? Like all the buzzword that we learn. Take a distance, like Bourdieu says. Let's be reflexive about our use. And the essentially contested concept is exactly the concept that makes us take a distance. This is contested, but we can make a description of that without problem. People won't like the description. That's the problem with sociology. But you said the problem with sociology is that people talk, which seems bizarre, but it's easy to understand it. For a physicist who says the electron will go there, that's done. If I say that will happen, oh, I disagree because the union don't like what I say, because I describe their strategy, they don't want that. So sociology is a problem. So philosopher has to be more reflexive and also go back to Bachelard, who, like Quine says, we have to understand the science and make more explicit what they do in practice. That's what Bachelard said in 1937. So it's more of a complement than everything else.
All I'll say about the reproducibility crisis is I'm with you here, and I always, whenever things move in this sense, as your comments did, I have in the back of my mind, professor in my graduate program. I never got to take one of his classes, but Phil Mirowski, a famed economist of science, was always in our reading groups, and he would listen to the philosophers and historians, and we would occasionally have a sociologist, prattling on about a book. And he'd be back in the corner he always sat in the farthest corner he could find to distance himself from us. And he would listen to us prattling on, and finally he would get exasperated enough to just go, follow the money. And to be like fair, like, okay, you know what? Yeah, usually we weren't. And then if we reconstructed, the biotech companies, all of a sudden, we follow the money. So yeah, maybe we just need to have another little follow the money reminder.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Time.